Great. Hi, everybody. Welcome to a presentation on recent work by the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance Mainnet Working Group. So today we're going to get through some legal stuff and then talk about an introduction to the Mainnet Working Group and the task forces that have been formed within the working group. There are 4 of them to do the actual work. And then we'll have time for some Q&A, which will be moderated by Nicholas Merton of DataDash. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please post them in the YouTube chat, and we'll try to get to those at the end of the call. So this is not an EEA meeting. This is a meeting held by the presenters as individuals. Please do not share any proprietary or confidential information. Anything you do contribute should be considered in the public domain. Okay, so what is the Mainnet Working Group? The EEA has several working groups that do most of the work within the EEA, and this new working group was formed late last year. And the mission of it is to make Mainnet ready for business and business ready for Mainnet. This is kind of a slight shift in focus or direction, because the EEA has historically been focused mainly on private chains. So Enterprise Ethereum has kind of been synonymous with private permission blockchains, Ethereum-style blockchains. But that shift is changing, and now we're looking at getting enterprise applications on the public Ethereum mainnet. So the working group is doing kind of has several forks. One is to educate enterprise developers, architects, and management on the benefits of using Mainnet and to dispel myths around that. Also developing standards and specifications related to enterprise uses or enterprise applications on Mainnet. And also advocating or giving a voice to the needs of enterprise users and developers to the greater Ethereum ecosystem. A lot of the ecosystem currently doesn't really focus on enterprise needs, and we want to sort of advocate and be a voice for that. So the main networking group currently consists of about 70 members, it's led by myself, John from Consensus, York from Microsoft, and Karthik from Ernst & Young. Okay, so public versus private Ethereum chains. As I mentioned earlier, most enterprise applications now that are using blockchains are using private permission blockchains, whether it's Ethereum or something else. But there seems to be a change in the tides, and according to a survey that was done by Forrester last year, a lot of the firms, up to 75% of the firms that have been building on private chains are considering or planning to build on public chains. Why is that? There are several potential benefits to building on Mainnet for enterprises. One is interoperability with other applications. So there's a wealth of things on Mainnet, like all of the DeFi applications, all the other dApps. And if you build on Mainnet, you have the potential to interoperate with them. So for example, if you're building a financial application, then you have the ability to interact with all of the DeFi stuff that's out there that could be beneficial. Also to interact with other companies, other consortia, other enterprises that are on Ethereum mainnet as well. So it's kind of the idea of having one internet that we all connect to each other through versus having separate siloed private networks. Also, another application or another benefit of mainnet is that it can be used as a neutral kind of tamper-resistant notary. So you can write some data or a hash of some data to the chain, and it's time-stamped, and you can prove that data existed at a certain time. It can also be thought of as a common frame of reference for different firms. So if different companies want to interact and they don't necessarily trust each other, they could potentially all agree that what's on Ethereum mainnet is the ground truth, and build from there up. And also, if a business goes under, data on mainnet will likely still be there. This is important for applications like education credentials, where let's say if your diploma is issued on a private chain or a private database by a company, and that company goes under in 10 years, will you still have your diploma? How will you prove that you got your PhD? It's more likely to be around if that data is on mainnet. And finally, according to a report put out by E&Y last year, it may actually be less costly to run an application on mainnet than on a private chain, depending on the application and the requirements for it. So here are a few examples of enterprise applications that are currently running on mainnet now. There's a company called CargoX, which does bill of lading documentation for freight transport and logistics. There are several banks that have done things. So Santander has issued some bonds and done settlement bonds. Societe Generale has done a pilot with bond issuance. A company called Cadence has done a tokenized bond offering for fat brands. BBVA, another bank, issues loans. So they negotiate the loans on a private chain, but once the loans are finalized, they are recorded on Ethereum mainnet. There's a retail electricity provider called Grid Plus that does payments on mainnet. Splunk is a company that produces a product called Splunk, which is widely used by companies to gather and archive log data, which is collected from their IT systems and data centers. And that data needs to be protected against tampering and kept for sometimes several years for compliance purposes. And so they have the ability now to sort of notarize this data by hashing and writing that to mainnet so that it's possible to prove that the log data has not been tampered with. This is very useful for things like SOC 2 compliance, PCI compliance, HIPAA, whatever. And then also there are a number of education credential projects that have issued diplomas on mainnet. So there are a couple of Italian high schools, university in Switzerland, and one in South Korea. Apparently all of Malta's educational certificates are now on Ethereum. And there's a company called BlockCerts that has developed the standards around this. So none of these are massively successful yet, but these are early days. Some of these are past the pilot stage. They're in production. So it's exciting to see that. Okay, now I'll talk about the first task force, which is called the Enterprise Use Cases and Requirements Task Force. Kind of a boring name. But the mission, I think, is important. It's to help align the allocation of resources, such as project funding and developer effort, in the Ethereum community with the needs of enterprise applications and developers. So this is important because most of the stuff that goes on in the Ethereum community doesn't really consider enterprise needs. And we hope to change this and show that by identifying and removing some of the barriers to enterprise developers building on mainnet, we can get some of these applications on board. So the task force will explore and document some of the most relevant use cases involving enterprise applications on mainnet, prioritize those use cases, and see which ones are most feasible, least feasible, which ones can be done today versus tomorrow, which ones have the biggest ROI or the biggest impact, and then identify requirements that can be shared with the community and used as a starting point for designing and building technical solutions to fill any existing gaps. So if there are some technical hurdles, such as things around identity, privacy, scalability, we want to dig into those, understand exactly what the requirements are so that we can get those things built and have them meet the needs of enterprises to build on mainnet. So we started a survey. We are surveying enterprise developers, architects, anybody who has thoughts on what applications could be built on mainnet and the challenges to doing so, and also the benefits. And if you're interested in participating, here's a link. There will be a link at the end of the presentation as well, so you don't have to write this down. And we'll put a link to the slides in the YouTube description of the presentation. I think that's probably there now. So in addition to the survey, we're interviewing enterprise architects, developers, consultants, anybody who has thoughts on what those applications, what applications they could put on mainnet, what the benefits of doing that, and what the challenges are. So if you have any thoughts on this, please contact us. We would love to talk to you. And now we'll turn it over to Stefan from Unibright to talk about the Eminent Task Force. And I think, Stefan, you'll share your screen.
Yes, right away. Okay. Yeah, this is Stefan. Hello, I'm CTO of Unibright from Germany and one of the members of the Integration Task Force. So the Ethereum Mainnet Integration for Enterprises Task Force, or shortly Eminent, is one of the task forces that's organized under the EEA Mainnet Working Group. And the task force focus is to build open source available reference implementations, guidelines for mainnet integration for enterprises and their systems of record. So perhaps a short explanation. Every software that serves as a backbone for a particular business process could be seen as a system of record. So nowadays, it's mainly centralized, perhaps cloud-based systems like SAP or Oracle or others offer. And these are ERP systems. So basically they're holding all the prices of a company, all materials, all customers, all offers, all invoices, and so on. And nowadays, most of them are off-chain systems. And everywhere where such a system of record needs to connect to the public Ethereum blockchain, what we understand as the mainnet integration happens or is needed. So the task force, the integration task force, also follows the mission of the mainnet working group. And therefore, in that task force, we see integration from two different views. The one is getting enterprises ready for mainnet. So this is about process integration. So identifying processes or even partial processes that could benefit from using blockchain. It's about finding and defining the right amount of process or workflow steps that should be handled off-chain and could be handled on-chain. So for example, exchanging quotes on a request for proposal process. So everything on this view is about to answer the questions, what could I use the mainnet for in my processes? And the other view is getting the mainnet ready for enterprises. So this is more a technical view. It's about caring about the existing IT system landscapes that are already in place, how they could or should interact with the mainnet. So this is not so much about a specific process or use case, but rather about the ground laying technical integration and to answer the questions how to connect to the mainnet. And these two views on integration also define the potential results that we want to bring to life with the task force. So on one hand, finding the right use cases and processes that need integration. And this is also based on what the use case task force that Tash just introduced identifies as reasonable use cases. So we're trying to build upon that. Another potential outcome should be standards that all players in the market can rely on and build their products upon. And of course, also have some coding and reference implementations under open source to showcase and explain different aspects of integration. So one example would be that we organize distributed hackathons among team members or members of the task force. So currently there's a hackathon going on with Unibright, AnyBlock, Provide, and others to show an SAP integration, an automatic setup, and monitoring views based on the baseline protocol. So the baseline protocol itself is not the only target of the integration task force for the reference implementations, but it's a very important one because the baseline protocol understands the mainnet as middleware, as a common frame of reference. So it's just a perfect tool, so to say, for us to show all relevant aspects of business integration. And the baseline introduction will follow in this presentation as well. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Stefan. I will go back to my slides, and John will talk about baseline.
All right, I'm unmuted now. And I warn everyone, a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old prowl my home now, so you may hear screams or other unpleasantness. Yeah, so it's great to be talking about the baseline protocol. Clearly, the mainnet is the baseline protocol team started in March. It's an openly governed open source community governed by by Oasis, which is a venerable open source and open standards institution that was behind SGML and many other standards in the internet. And what we have with Baseline is a a project that's all about how to use the mainnet in such a way that the scary-looking person there on the screen, who we call Cecil the CISO, would find accessible or acceptable for use in a corporate setting where conservative, security-minded people need to think seriously about PII, personally identifiable information, and also sensitive information, which, let's be honest, 80% of most companies' information is sensitive insofar as they would neither want their information to be had by their competitors, nor would they want the information about that information, and beyond just metadata, even trace data of what they're doing with other parties, and what their volumes are, what how the health of their business. These are things that most companies don't want other companies to know about unless they permit it. So how do you work on a blockchain with such a requirement? And it turns out even private blockchains really have this problem. All blockchains are effectively digital nudist colonies. Anybody who has access to that or is maintaining the integrity of the ledger of a private or public blockchain has the ledger and is able to put our AI at it and point an AI at it and learn all sorts of things just by generating classifiers and doing an analysis. So how would you use the mainnet in such a way that you were not giving up any information to the public or to competitors, even trace information, and yet you would have utility where it's worth using the mainnet? Well, the notion was use the mainnet as middleware. Use it as a way to ensure that you and I and three other of us know for sure that the record that each of us is storing in our traditional system of record, like an ERP system like SAP or Salesforce or DB2 or Mongo or your COBOL system you wrote in the 70s, whatever it is, if I have a record and I'm sharing it with you, and you, we know for sure that each of us has the same record, even though we're not putting that record on the blockchain. We're using the blockchain as a two-state machine to say we are consistent or we are not consistent. And beyond that, the mainnet doesn't know much to tell anybody about. And if you do this in the right way, you wind up with a pattern of activity on the mainnet that would look like noise or would sound like a metronome ticking, tick, tick, tick. There's just nothing there to analyze. So we thought that was a pretty radical way of looking at the mainnet. And the most radical thing about it is how boring it is, because we've been doing this kind of thing in distributed systems for decades and decades, right? MQ and Kafka and other pieces of enterprise service buses that allow us to maintain consistency between systems of record. But those are expensive, typically have been, and they take a while to set up, and you got to pay somebody who knows what they're doing to do it usually, and they want to take rents. And so you wind up only doing this sort of thing with your biggest, most high volume, most profitable partners. I mean, long story short, the baseline protocol community is getting bigger, is really quite exciting. There's hundreds of people working on it. And if you want to get involved, go to, I think the easiest thing is to go to https docs.baselineprotocol.org. baseline-protocol.org, and you can find out more about it.
Awesome, thanks, John. Next, we have Hudson to talk about the Education Task Force. Get Hudson
All right,
started.
yeah. Education Task Force. We have. Yeah, I'm removing more people. The Education Task Force is something within the EEA where we're just trying to do. Trying to educate the businesses with like short articles that we can just like bite-sized pieces, and with that we can disseminate information. Let me pull up the slides here. I'm blanking. Oh yeah, so we can ideate and execute our first educational article on the Ethereum mainnet towards businesses from the Ethereum mainnet working group. So we might interview like a prominent Ethereum enthusiast or like get an article dispelling rumors about mainnet and You can contact me at hudson@ethereum.org or at Hudson Jameson on Twitter if you want to get involved in this a bit. This is going to be something that's a little bit more, I think this is like pretty straightforward. We're just making articles for the most part at first. And yeah, I think that's about it.
All right, thanks, Hudson. Next, we have Owen to talk about the messaging task force.
So, hi everyone on the Zoom call. Hi all the new people on the Zoom call, especially the ones using the whiteboard feature. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk about what we're doing with the messaging task force for the EEA mainnet. So, one of the high-level use cases of blockchain involves attestation. So people have talked about, for example, anchoring data and putting tiny amounts of records and data on the blockchain and then having huge amounts of data off it. So for example, we might be putting a tiny hash or a Merkle root or a zero knowledge hook on chain. And then we have a need to share huge amounts of information off chain, be it petabytes of large files, for example, or maybe thousands of small messages a second over our message bus. So interestingly, Peter Zilgalfis, the head of digital innovation and blockchain in the European Commission, said just today that the European Commission believes that blockchain presents an excellent technology for situations where stakeholders need to collaborate, but because of competitive or legal reasons, they don't want to share or they're unable to share a single database. So he gave examples of use case around document certification, self-sovereign identities, or regular reporting that could be made more efficient using a blockchain. And all of those are attestation use cases. So you're going to put a small record on chain and then you've got a gigantic amount of records to share off chain, especially in something like self-sovereign identities. If you're running identity as a service, you're a mobile provider or something on chain. So, and this is where the messaging task force comes in. So let me just swap over to my slides. So our vision is the establishment of enterprise requirements around mainnet anchored off-chain communications, both large files and small, very fast messaging. So what we're doing is we're surveying enterprises operating on blockchain to challenge our assumptions, and we're creating a straw man approach based on existing technology standards and protocols. So I'll just talk a little bit about our assumptions. The key assumption is that enterprise decentralized messaging, we want this to be decentralized or else we're instituting a large third-party centralized messaging solution that everybody will want to use or not want to use. So enterprise decentralized messaging is very different to consumer decentralized messaging. So key differences are, for example, absolutely no sharing of data with unauthorized parties, even if it's encrypted. That's just not something any enterprise would want to have happen. So absolute, John talked about this previously, absolute metadata and data privacy, right? Unless you're the regulator, you have no rights to see any of this data, see how often I'm interacting with the system or anything like that. You get no data whatsoever from me if you're not my participant in this data. So other differences as an enterprise, we can provide an always on service. We've got fixed endpoints, you know where we are and who we are. That means discoverability is less of a concern because our interactions are going to be over legal agreements or contracts. And that means digital identity for us is like standard mechanisms. We have our public key infrastructure, we have X509 certs. We want to run on-premise or in the cloud. We want to have flexibility. We don't want to have vendor lock-in. We already have our enterprise agreements, so we don't want to change them. We want to use common interfaces and protocols to ensure interoperability. Stefan talked about where this data is coming from. This data is coming from your content management systems, your document management systems, your ERP systems, your SQL databases, your ancient mainframes, for example, running DB2 and gigantic amounts of data swapping and batch files. So it means integration is absolutely a concern. And the objective there, and this is more for the eminent task force, is to use existing standards for integration. So EDI, Swift messages, etc. And probably if I have to leave you with a closing thought is that the technology to provide this sort of large data transfer securely and privately between businesses isn't anything new. It's literally a solved problem. And the only difference now is, for example, that solved problem includes an element of Ethereum mainnet in it. And that's it for the messaging task force. Thanks very much, everyone.
Awesome, thanks, Owen. So that's the end of the presentation. There's a slide for resources. If you can open the Google Docs link, the second to last slide has contact information for us, as well as information about how to join the EEA, how to participate in the use cases survey, link to baseline, and also Ethereum Magicians, which is a great way to get involved with the Ethereum community. So now we've got some time for Q&A, and Nicholas will moderate that.
Thank you, Toss. So yeah, we got a good few questions coming through the chat here. The first one that I saw earlier that I thought was pretty interesting is you were bringing up earlier, John, about the difference between people going over from private blockchains over to public. The question here, just to really kind of get a summary here from what you've learned over the last couple of months, maybe the past couple of years, is there really any benefit from using like a private blockchain versus just like a private database and working with your traditional ERP systems that again are very clear from switching over to Mainnet? Like, can you talk about maybe some of those benefits or maybe some of those problems that come with just simply using a private network?
Yeah, I think there's nothing wrong with private databases or shared databases, right? I mean, in fact, they're quite useful for lots of things. I think that when we call them shared databases or shared state machines, it's easier to understand what they're good for and what they're not good for. GitHub is a pretty good shared state machine. There's a lot of utility there, but there's a misapprehension of what you can use it for and what you should use it for. And that's where I start to part ways with the private blockchain thinking that I guess I have to say I had a hand in kind of starting. So for that, I think it's what's the mistake to avoid is when a high-level executive thinks of it as a more safe database, because it's not, right? A shared state machine, your worst system admin is your weakest link, and if they get hacked by Mr. Robot or any of these photo bombers or Zoom bombers, then everybody gets made. So I like the idea of using the mainnet. If we can use the mainnet in enterprise without compromising security in any way that would that a traditional CISO or security officer would consider objectionable, then we should be able to do it for any private blockchain too. The only point I would make there is, why create another silo that you're going to then have to have a silo to join with other silos, and then another silo to join with other silos. Ultimately, and that might be the right answer for some things. You can get some more speed out of a private blockchain. You can use it for the back end of different kinds of games where you wouldn't want to do that with the lag on a public mainnet. But ultimately, you want the last silo to be as proof against somebody getting control of it, locking you out, or changing history as possible. And you'll give up a lot of speed and other things for that.
Yeah, and to build on that point again, I remember when you were going through your slides, John, earlier, the thing that I noticed as well is when you're on Mainnet, you can interact with other applications that have been deployed on Mainnet. I think of it as almost kind of like a hub in this sense for a lot of value to kind of culminate between different applications and different companies. So one thing I wanted to ask you about, you were talking about, you guys listed, I know Taz had mentioned as well at the beginning of the presentation that there's some applications that have been launched on Mainnet that are currently using Ethereum, for example, bond issuance, basically supply chain logistics. I was curious, from what you guys have seen, and this can be a question for the group all around, what applications have people wanted to interact with that are on Mainnet currently? What industries have really provided a good use case for Ethereum to serve as a middleware solution in any company's tech stack?
Was that
it's honestly, anyone feel free to join in that. I think, John, you're welcome to talk about it if you want. Taz as well, maybe you.
Yeah, I can also answer if you want, John.
Yeah, York, I was just thinking you'd be a pretty good person to talk about that.
Yeah, so the thesis here is that if you have a common frame of reference on something like the internet, this case enabled by a transaction machine, that you could then transact with, in theory, anyone else if you can validate their endpoint, right? And do that securely with knowledge that you're not sharing data improperly with anyone except for who it's intended for. And so if you look at if you sort of take a step back and say, why do people join consortiums in general in a private context? It's exactly for that reason, because they want to do business with end parties in a multi-party workflow that is easier than doing point-to-point EDI type of conversations with a lot of setup and pain with every individual party. Right, so the concept here and the way you want to think about the mainnet is, from an enterprise perspective, it is basically the ultimate consortium. it is the world of consortiums, right? It's a single place you can go, just like we transact business over the internet with other businesses through e-commerce and other types of B2B e-commerce. The idea here is exactly the same as that.
To build on that, York, just I think something that a lot of people have been curious about when we're talking about EIPs, and just in your take, do you think that we're going to see snarks integrated on Ethereum's blockchain anytime soon? And if not that, do you think it's something that's imperative if we want to make sure that Ethereum can serve as kind of this middleware where companies can come together? Is that kind of one of the shared objectives throughout Baseline?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the necessity for privacy of data as well as privacy of metadata to a transaction, it's both are equally important. And so the construct that the Baseline team came up with here in this example was basically to protect against the types of data harvesting that you would try to do if you're trying to figure out what's the relationship between two parties, right, across a public network, and how might I infer volumes of transactions and types of transactions from the data that's available that I can harvest, right? And so, for example, if let's say there's a launch of a new product or something like that, right, on the internet, if you could identify transactional behavior between 2 points on the internet, you might be able to infer something about that product and the types of customers that they're serving and the needs that they're serving, potentially harvest the data associated with that, right? And then basically use that to infer potential parties to those transactions and start to, even if the data is not really there and accessible, right? Just being able to infer probabilities is actually quite valuable in the context of, security breaches.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in real quick because you mentioned EIPs, and we actually had a really, really productive core developer call today. And one of the EIPs that we're considering putting into the next network upgrade is one that reduces the cost of a certain cryptographic precompile in the system that makes using something like ZK Starks and ZK Snarks much, much cheaper. So right now, a big hurdle that we have for a lot of these systems that do privacy preserving algorithms on Ethereum is the cost. It's very expensive to do computationally and therefore in monetary value to do these type of things on Ethereum mainnet. So reducing that cost is going to be a really big deal, I think. And I know we have a lot of people who are working very hard involving these kind of protocols into Baseline. So that's just kind of what I feel like is the future, is these privacy preserving devices and different programs on the Ethereum mainnet to make sure that you can have private data privacy that you couldn't have before.
Yeah, absolutely. To build on that, Hudson, that's true. I remember back just about a year ago and stuff, the kind of general cost it would take to send a private transaction over like a private centric network like Monero. And through the creation of things like bulletproofs and everything that can drill down that price, I think you're going to get something that, again, is serving as a public chain, as an open kind of sector for people to interact with one another in unique ways, being able to make that privacy less expensive, but also removing the need to trust a centralized or third-party systems is going to be a huge benefit. And I think we'll kind of play into that role of Ethereum serving as a middleware solution. Another thing I wanted to kind of get your guys' take on, again, anyone feel free to jump in on this. I think Baseline itself sounds like a very fascinating culmination for Ethereum to serve as a middleware solution. I think people get that idea, like a lot of people have proposed for a lot of other blockchain applications to serve as middleware in a tech stack. But I'm curious, what is it going to look like for an enterprise company if we were talking to someone right now who wanted to build an application that integrates Ethereum's mainnet in some kind of capacity? Is there a good example you guys could bring up of what that would look like and what the process is of integrating Baseline? Maybe more in like a visual capacity in this case.
There's some, I think the beyond Baseline, there's the Unibrights here, Chainlink and others, Rhombus are companies that specialize in connecting data sources. Now the particular need in the case of Baseline is connecting it to, the use case is more about very small amounts of companies who or entities who have a small amount of data that they're sharing, as opposed to say, publishing LIBOR or how many stars are in this part of the sky or something like that, where you'd want a, sort of a definitive truth oracle. But when you're connecting the a corporate system of record to the mainnet, a lot of the same. Maybe Stefan can say a few things about the requirements.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's also been some evolvement in the storytelling about why enterprises should use blockchain. We also noticed that in our daily work. So the argument like 2 or 3 years ago was mainly to see the blockchain as a distributed database. And then the counter argument was like we could all use it as a world computer and have everything in smart contracts running in the public Ethereum. And now handling or understanding it more as a middleware bus makes it way more easier, I guess, to convince enterprises to get their hands dirty with blockchain, so to say, because now it's, John always says it's a very boring approach, but of course, understanding middleware is not only boring, it is also something that all the enterprises and companies are already used to. So if you just put the benefits of a public available, always on middleware bus like blockchain into the picture, then it's easier for for enterprises to stay in their thinking of their business processes and use this new bus and the new possibilities that come along with it. And personally, I think it's all about standards. I mean, if a company builds products around integration and is able to rely on open source standards and standards that a very large group agreed on, then it makes things easier for all of them, not only for the big players, but also for the very small ones that now can rely on standards and how to be part of that middleware bus.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just to build on the point that you'd also brought up earlier, John, I think between Baseline, Chainlink, and also Unibright, I think we're finally seeing over the last maybe 2 or 3 years, the culmination of a lot of the problems that were persistent within enterprise blockchain that kept companies from adopting it, finally being cured in this case, because I think it's a much clearer picture as to not only how we can fix those issues, those roadblocks from people getting it adopted, but it also serves in a much better framework now where, again, we're, I think, providing a much more professional and clear image of what Ethereum is. It's going to serve as a part of the tech stack. Blockchain isn't really per se the new internet. It's a stack within the internet. And I think that it's going to provide a lot of value being able to remove, the need for trust in this case, to be able to have a public record in a sense of Baseline, really using the ledger in this case to have immutable proof that some kind of transaction has happened, having something like Chainlink in this case to communicate to outside systems, and along with that as well, Unibright in the sense of its smart contract framework, its STO platform. So a lot of interesting problems being solved and finally kind of coming to culmination and fruition in the blockchain space.
Let me just add to that. If you think about like building a full stack application in a cloud environment, such as Azure, one of the things that you actually use for resilience is a message bus. It gives you an opportunity to queue things up faster than transactions can be processed, and also the ability to have multiple subscribers to that data that have permissions to get to that data. And we typically do that within the context of a security perimeter of a single enterprise. Now, imagine if you could do the same thing across the security perimeter from one enterprise to another. That's actually quite interesting. And that's this type of framework, right? This pattern that we've described in Baseline is exactly that.
My favorite example of that, York, is imagine a big logistics shipping company, if you will, and you may make, but they may make products that compete with your product, and you're obliged to use them as your shipper. I can't imagine what company that might look like, but in that case, wouldn't it be nice if they couldn't know anything about what you are delivering to your customer and what your volumes are, what the health of your business is, which right now they can look up in their own database. But with a universal message bus type of a thing, that's why I've got that's my magic bus above me on my wall there. Thank you, TJ Schmelski, for drawing that for me. With a magic bus like the mainnet, you can dead drop that, right? So the shipper can put a topic and a key and a value onto the mainnet, and nobody really, it doesn't look like anything to anybody. It's kind of noise, But if I'm watching that particular location and I have that hash, I can see that they gave me the delivery date, which I can use to calculate my invoice with the customer with a verified date, where they don't know anything about what I was using it for. It's a pub sub. So it's like a compartmentalized, siloless compartmentalization is kind of like, you can compartmentalize workflow steps down to the record, down to a particular function, and compartmentalize who gets to see it, access it, or even be aware it's happening. But you can integrate any workflow with any other workflow because all of those joins are just sitting there on the mainnet.
Awesome. I think
interestingly as well, what we also get with the mainnet is, for example, as John spoke about it previously, if I always interact once every minute or once every 10 minutes with the mainnet, but there's an arbitrary random amount of data associated with that for my particular entities that I want to have authorized to access it and then prove this information is true based on this store of trust, which is the mainnet. Nobody gets anything from that. They just see the regular interactions. If I'm issuing more letters of credit that day, it's the same number of interactions. If I got another 500 suppliers onto my supply chain, it's still the same number of interactions. So the only people that can see it are those suppliers. I mean, it's a critical aspect, but that bus is always available and everybody can read it. So we can always interact.
That's awesome explanation. Good. All right, guys. Well, that was the majority of the questions that I really picked up from the chat. But is there any other areas that you all want to hit on in the sense of explaining some of the major things we're seeing through the EEA? Is there any big updates that maybe we didn't cover in the slides that would be important for people to understand?
Well, let me, I'll hazard a PSA here, which is, the Mainnet working group is a joint collaboration of the Ethereum Foundation and the EEA and a bunch of other folks. And so in our unique role, and I'm sure Tosh would agree, is to join the communities and to listen to each other and really learn how to make the business ready for the mainnet, and mainnet ready for business, and to do so together. So while this is a public meeting and we don't want any, we don't want to breach the EEA's rules or any kind. If you have ideas about how the mainnet needs to be improved for business, make sure to put that into get to your your Ethereum Foundation representative, somebody like Tosh, and communicate with them so that we can get that input into our specification work.
Absolutely, guys. Yeah, feel free to reach out to any of the social media, reach out to the community in this case. I know Ethereum is probably out of any public chain and stuff the most open to new ideas and criticism. I've seen constant improvement. One thing I wanted to ask you all about personally, this is one that I was definitely interested in. When we were talking about some of the applications that were interesting within the Ethereum ecosystem that people want to integrate with, I've been really passionate about decentralized finance and DeFi. Have you seen any type of traditional companies, as we were talking about in the finance sector, that have been, for example, issuing bonds on Ethereum? Have you seen any interest with them integrating with some of the more popular DeFi apps?
I haven't seen that, and I think hopefully we will see that in the future. But I think a lot of financial companies are kind of scared of DeFi right now, so it may take a bit of time.
I think a lot of them are not commenting on it, but there's some terrific bonds and other Santander is doing bond issuance, and they're very public about it and very proud of it, and they're on the board of EEA. So that's one great example, and I wouldn't dare to comment on their work with DeFi, but I think it's generally true that more and more financial institutions are certainly getting very serious about it. It's how you do it too. I mean, there's ways to do it and there's ways not to do it, and these guys are going to be careful to do it the right way.
Yeah, to build on that, John, that's a very good point, because the issue I think sometimes is that people don't realize that between the two terms that get talked about, there's DeFi and then there's CeFi. centralized finance and decentralized finance. And I would say Santander, for example, issuing bonds would be more CeFi. It's coming from a traditional corporation, in this case, is using Ethereum to issue those bonds. And you have applications that are smart contracts that are completely autonomous. So what I think we're going to see over the next couple of months is a really interesting kind of middle point or set of hybrids between CeFi and DeFi, where things aren't entirely centralized, but also things aren't entirely decentralized. And I think that's, again, a good scale there, where you have things like Compound that almost are nearly autonomous in nature. And then you have things, for example, like you mentioned, Santander issuing bonds. So really interesting discussion, guys. I think that's it in the sense of questions that I picked up from the YouTube and Zoom chat here. But if there's anything else you guys want to discuss, I'll let you guys take it away. I'll let Toss, I guess, take it away here.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll have these meetings periodically. So hopefully once a quarter, and maybe we could cover some more of those topics in more depth next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.